All right, so we are recording today, and I'm going to get started here. Ivy's going to monitor the chat. Christian's going to take notes. So I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. The topic today is adapting to online teaching and promoting student success. First, I'll introduce the panelists. We have Cassandre Alvarado. She is our fairly new Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education. We also have Gary Wilcox from the Stan Richards School of Advertising and Public Relations. Also Dina Inman from Communication Studies. And Mallary Tenore, who is a journalism instructor as well as Associate Director of the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas. And I was reading Mallary's bio yesterday, and she has got some long history, impressive history at the Poynter Institute. All right, so please hold your questions for the last 15 minutes. We will open it up for Q&A in the last 15 minutes of this session. Feel free to enter your questions into the text chat. Ivy, our journalism graduate student, will be monitoring the chat and collecting questions. We will get to as many as we can, and those that we can't get to, we will try to answer when we send out the notes. All right, so we are going to cover a lot today, so panelists, let's get started. This first question, I'd like to hear from each of you, and I'll call on you one at a time. This question is not specific to online teaching. It's about student success in general. And so my question is, what do you think is most important for instructors to do to support student success this fall? Let's start with Cassandre.
Thanks, Mary. For me, the most important thing that faculty can do to support student success this fall is to learn and use your students' names. We have data, evidence from not only our institution, but from other institutions across the country that there is a statistically significant impact of having a faculty member who knows you by name on student success. And that student success measures meaning whether they're retained, whether they pass a course, and whether they ultimately graduate from the institution. It's very simple, but sometimes not simple, because learning students' names in large classes can be extraordinarily challenging. And finding ways in virtual environments to do that well can also be challenging, but it is a very simple and real thing that faculty can do that will have a direct impact on student success.
Very good, thank you very much. And I think Zoom makes it a little bit easier because their name is right there under their face. Yeah. Okay, Gary, let's hear from you. What do you recommend for supporting student success?
Well, I echo what Cassandre has to say for sure. I have a couple of challenges. I teach an intro class that will be all online, and then I'll teach a social media class that's a hybrid, and we'll actually meet. One's 150 and another is 15, so that's two very different scenarios that I work. And so for the big class, for freshmen and sophomores, I just try to keep it simple, make everything really, really straightforward and not complicated, because the mechanism is a little more complicated than it used to be. And so if I can make my communication as simple as possible, then I think that's a winning strategy. And for the other class, that's really much more, I'll call almost hands-on. We're going to meet once a month live. And so I'll actually really get to know those kids. I don't get to know the ones in the intro class unless they reach out, and a handful do. But I'm always interested in what everybody else has got to say about this stuff too. We're learning as we move along, and I enjoy learning new things all the time. So somebody else have some good ideas.
All right. So how about Dina? What are your tips for student success?
Yeah, sure. For me, it's all about the plan and making sure that your plan for the class is shared with the class, meaning they can see the entire class from the very start. So I like to plan everything and have it set in modules from the very beginning. if they know what's coming, then they're able to build the class within their schedule, rather than just leaving it till the week before where they're guessing. So in order for them to be successful, I feel like you have to have a roadmap from the beginning to the end of the semester.
All right, good ideas. Okay, now let's hear from Mallory. What are your tips for student success?
Great. So I would say that getting students' input has been really helpful and is really important. So when I taught a course in June, it was the first time we offered this course online. And I was really trying to figure out, okay, how do I best accommodate students, knowing that this class is not scheduled at a particular time. And so I wanted to know if students, for instance, wanted to have live sessions as well as recorded sessions. So I sent out a survey. I just created a Google form survey that I sent to students ahead of time, getting their input on sort of when they would want to meet, what time they would want to meet, and asking other questions like, how long would you want the recorded lectures to be, right? Because when we transitioned online in the spring, I was posting recorded lectures that were an hour long, and it became quite clear that that was hard for students to digest. So in the summer, I sort of adjusted that and offered up more kind of, chunk size videos where I would have videos that were no longer than 15 minutes typically. And sometimes I would post, 3 videos of 15 minutes for one lecture, but that made it more digestible. And so really sort of checking in with students and saying, okay, how can I best accommodate you? And, based on the students' responses to the survey, I actually did adapt some of my strategies and determined that it was best if, for that particular class, we met twice a week live, and then 3 times a week, the sessions would be recorded. As part of this too, I think also broadening the lines of communication is critical. So, for an in-person class, I would normally be, of course, meeting with students in person or answering questions via email. But for me, at least, I have found it to be very helpful to be as accessible as possible, and have encouraged students to text me, to call me. I created a group me account for my class in the summer so that students could interact with each other. It's sort of like a group text feature. And so for me, that was helpful because in some ways it enabled me to meet students where they were. For some students, it was easier for them to text me. Other students wanted to have, a Zoom call. So I basically was trying to accommodate students based on what they wanted and needed. And I personally didn't set up a set sort of, Zoom office hour time. I more so just told students, let me know when you want to meet and we'll figure out a time that works. So I think that was really helpful because it helped them to feel a little bit less lost, which can happen, I think, when you're in a virtual setting and not really seeing students face to face.
Yeah. Great tips, some really good best practices there. All right, thank you. All right, let's move on to the next question, and this can apply to face-to-face or hybrid courses, but I'm particularly interested in online courses. And so students can feel a lot of uncertainty going into online courses, not knowing what to expect, and there's so much variation between the way various instructors do their courses. So my question to you is, how can you set student expectations about what your course is and how it works? And for what specific attributes of the course do you need to set expectations? And let's start with Dina. Dina, are you there? Dina may be muted. I think we may have lost Dina. I'm scrolling through. Okay. Let's go with Gary. How about you, Gary? How do you set student expectations, and what do you need to set expectations about?
Well, that's a great question for me because the intro class I teach has a bar on it. Let's call it a bar. You have to jump over the bar. It's a B or better to move on in the major. And so they're freshmen and sophomores, and many of them are distracted when they get here. Maybe not so much now this semester, but in other semesters, they're distracted. They're all really, really smart and all deserve to be in, make a B, but they don't all. And so I try to set expectations early, give them practice exams, let them come in and talk to the TA. And thank goodness this semester, thanks to Mary Crawford, I have a ULA in there, and I'm excited about how to use that. If maybe somebody has ideas they can share, I'd love to hear those as well. But, you know, basically saying, hey, here's how many points it takes to make a B. Here's what you have to do. Here's some study tips. Here's some other students that have done well in the class. Here's what they have to say about how to study for the class and how to do well. And I think if they do that and pay attention and are semi-serious about it, they'll be fine.
All right, thank you, Gary. Mallory, how about you? How do you set student expectations, and what do you set expectations about?
Yeah, so for me in an online setting, it's really important to have participation. And I feel as though, you know, participation and attendance can get a little bit murkier when you're teaching online. And I found this to be true in the summer because students had a lot of competing priorities, or they had internet connection issues. And so what I ended up doing was, you know, there were a handful of students who couldn't attend a live lecture, either because they had another class scheduled at that time, or they had work or an internship. So I set the expectation that in order to sort of get participation points, they needed to have frequent conversations with me and one-on-ones. So for those students, I was able to set up weekly one-on-one Zoom sessions with them. And I plan to do something similar in the fall. The class I'm teaching will be a hybrid one. And so I plan to, you know, encourage people who can to come to campus for the in-person sessions. But for those who can't, you know, my plan is to sort of set up one-on-ones with them via Zoom, both to just help them feel included and help them feel connected. Another thing too with teaching online is I have set the expectation that I want students to turn their videos on, but I have tried to go about that in sort of an inclusive way, with the understanding that maybe some students are in a situation where they feel self-conscious about their background, for instance, and their living situation. So I sort of told students, you know, I want you to turn your videos on and I want you to be engaged. But, you know, let me know if for some reason that poses an issue for you. I haven't had any students who have said that it does, but usually at the start of every class, I have to remind students to turn on their videos, because for some of them, their inclination is to not do so. But that small step of just having everyone's video turned on actually does go a long way in terms of creating a greater sense of community. And I think it also helps the students to feel more engaged too, when they know that they're all sort of, you know, looking at each other and hopefully taking part in the conversation.
Thank you. That's important to reach out and make sure that they're comfortable doing this. But I agree that it really increases the social presence to see those faces. Mm-hmm. Cassandra, what are your recommendations for setting student expectations and what you need to set expectations about?
I think one of the most important expectations that we can set is how we want students to communicate with us, how we want them to engage with us, and how we want them to know that we care about them. I think particularly in online environments, when we set an expectation that a student can't meet because of bandwidth, because of home situation, because of family situations, without sharing an alternate way of communicating, a way of connecting, a way of participating, a way of earning those points, we may be subtly signaling to students that there's only one way to be successful. And I think all of us have realized, whether it's through our own experience on Zoom meetings like this, that there are multiple ways to engage and be successful, that it doesn't always have to be one single way. So when we set the expectation that there can be multiple ways of being successful, multiple ways of connecting with me as a faculty member, multiple ways of connecting with other students, that we set the expectation that we know and understand none of this is exactly how we want it to be, right? And even going so far as to say, this isn't how I wanted to teach. This isn't how I wanted to welcome you into this community. Or if it is the way you wanted to teach, tell them why you're excited to teach that way. I think everyone's kind of walking into this semester feeling a little bit like, this isn't what we wanted. If it is what you wanted, say it and be proud of it. And if it isn't, own it, so that students know we're all in this together, fumbling through ways that none of us imagined we would be. And no matter how much time we've had over the summer to pivot, it's not perfect. It's not perfect by the fact that we're already in this call alone, having folks drop off calls, having folks be muted and unmuted. It's a fact of life. And so if we pretend that it has to be perfect in order to be successful, then our students are going to fear that that's what they have to be. So setting that expectation that this is weird, this is hard, this is difficult, and we're all in this together, and there's more than one way to be successful, I think goes a long way to helping students connect with us and be successful in their course.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's come back around to Dina. Dina, what do you do to set student expectations, and what do you think it's important to set expectations about?
Well, not to regurgitate everything that everyone else has said, but I, in terms of what I get emails about from students, typically they want to know how they're going to be graded, you know, what is going to count as participation. All of these little minute details I'll get emails at the beginning. So in order to combat that, I make sure that I use a really detailed rubric on everything that is done or expected as far as the assignments. I also create an FAQ, which is just a short sheet with lots of questions that I know will probably pop into their minds about the class. All of this to kind of help them settle into the class and understand what's going to happen here. I'll put on my syllabus, you know, how does this class work, right? And I'll give them details on what does it look like? What does the structure look like? So I'm trying to get ahead of those questions that are probably going to come. You know, I teach one web-based class that's 150 students. So that I don't get 150 emails or 75 emails, I feel like if you set those expectations, the detailed rubric, and, you know, anticipate what those questions are going to be, they're going to be happier and a whole lot more accepting of what's going to happen.
All right. Thank you, Dina. Okay, moving on to the next question. This is specifically about pivoting from classroom instruction to online teaching. And a lot of people had to do this very quickly in the spring. It probably was not ideal, but I know that there are some success stories. So I would like you, and I'll call on you one by one, tell me about what was successful for you in pivoting to online teaching, and what can you recommend for other instructors as they adjust their assignments and course content for this fall. And let's start with Mallary. I know you have a success story.
Sure. So yeah, I ran into the issue, as many of you probably have, of not really wanting students to feel pressured to do any in-person interviews. And all the assignments from my class typically do require in-person interviews. So I, of course, still wanted them to get the experience of doing interviews. So I adapted each of the assignments. And so, for instance, typically I have students do an event story where they have to go somewhere on campus and cover an event. Obviously, that wasn't going to be feasible back in June when I was teaching the summer version of this course. So instead, I sort of reshaped it so that it would still be about an event, but rather an online event. So I had them cover an online event with the same sort of rigor that they would cover an in-person event with. Had them, still have to interview 3 sources. But to aid them in this, I sort of was gathering different webinars and online events that were coming up that were free and accessible. And I was sharing those with students as examples that they could pull from and as examples of stories that they could cover, while also encouraging them to go out and find other events that they may want to cover virtually. Another example was a profile story, which, normally when you're assigning students to cover a story about someone and write a profile about them, you want them to embed with that person and really meet with them in person, capture their surroundings, which wasn't going to be feasible, but I still wanted the students to have that experience of writing a profile story. So fortunately, there were only 18 students in my class. So I ended up just reaching out to various journalism colleagues who are in the news industry. And I found 18 great journalists from around the country who were willing to be interviewed by my students. And so essentially I created a sheet where I had the bios of 18 great journalists. And then I had a sign-up sheet where students could then sign up to interview one of the journalists. And so I encouraged them. I said, you have to do this on Zoom unless, the person really can't and they need to do it by phone. That's okay. But encourage them to do Zoom interviews and encourage them to ask the journalists they were interviewing about their surroundings and their Zoom background. And, the types of sort of sensory details that you would hope to capture in an in-person interview. And so I think that was helpful for them because they were then able to still do the profile piece and also learn about a journalist's work in that process of doing that, as opposed to saying, okay, you've got to somehow find someone to profile, even though you're all stuck at home and not really going out and meeting anyone. So I think that was helpful. And then just lastly, I'll mention that, one of my concerns was trying to gauge how many students were really engaged with the recorded lectures. And so I created this Take 10 assignment where essentially students were expected to write 2 to 3 sentences per lecture. And so we had 5 lectures, because it was a summer course. So there were 5 lectures per week. So they had to write 2 bulleted takeaways from each lecture. And it sounds simple, but it was sort of a way for me to hold them accountable in some ways. But it also was a really interesting way to get to know them a little bit better, because many of them sort of wove in personal anecdotes and kind of just experiences that sort of helped me better understand why a particular lesson or why a particular takeaway resonated with them. So it was a simple assignment that I felt like had an impact, and based on the students' feedback, it seems like they appreciated, having the chance to sort of share those takeaways, and it motivated them to stay on track too, which can be hard if you have mostly recorded lectures. It can be difficult to sort of keep up with those on a day-to-day basis.
All right. Sounds like it was very successful, and in adapting your assignments that you had planned for the online environment. Great, thank you. Gary, I want to turn to you. I know you teach the large class in person that you have done for many, many years and had to pivot in the spring. And I recall you saying that you got good reviews. So I'd like to hear what you did to pivot and adjust your assignments.
Yeah, and supposedly those reviews won't count. No, maybe they will. Let's hope they will. How that goes. Well, again, I'll go back to the idea of keeping it really simple and say, here's the assignment, here's the level you want to be at, and they've been turning in their assignments in Canvas for 5-6 years, and so I didn't really change very much. I don't have a lot of assignments in there. It's mostly exams. On the exams, I'll just tell you, I'm learning this stuff too. I didn't use the Proctorio, I think is whatever it's called. I just used Canvas and had enough questions in the bank that it would mix the questions and it would mix the answers. And I compared it to the last 2 or 3 semesters on averages, and I was really right on. And so I gave them 8 hours for the exam, a little flexibility there, and that seemed to work out okay. I was able to extend special people that need special time, thanks to Mary Crawford showing me how. And it's just kind of a learning experience. And I don't certainly have any magic. It turned out real well, and I think the kids, we had a good attitude when it all kind of fell apart. And I'll talk about that in the social class, maybe in another question. But that's kind of really it. And everything was still due. Everybody knew the stuff's going to be due. And spring was a little different because we were told we had to make some accommodations. But I ran the thing in the summer and didn't make any accommodations at all, and the kids did fine. And so just keep it simple and say, here's what you got to do, and here's the grade level you got to be at. And I think that worked for me in a big class.
Gary, did you do Zoom meetings and live sessions, or did you pre-record lectures?
I pre-recorded everything, and kind of my thought on that was something that you had said, and something we were, I think, told as a faculty at the university, is kind of teach to the lowest technology level. And I think that's important as well. You don't want to do an assignment that everybody can't succeed at. And so that's kind of what I did. I didn't do any live Zoom sessions with that. That class was almost 200. I didn't do any live Zoom sessions with that. But I'm sure one of my colleagues, Mark Bunting, has like 9,000 students in his class, and he probably has experience doing live Zoom stuff with that big group too. So, and I had a great TA this summer. I have to say a shout out to Patrick, who's on watching here, and he did a great job communicating with students, and he might have some insight on that too, because he handled a lot of the communication. And I would trust the TAs to do it as well. We got some great, smart graduate students with us here.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Okay, turning back to Dina, tell me what was successful for you. And this is not your online course, but your regular face-to-face course in pivoting for online. How did you make adjustments to that course as we moved online?
Sure. So I teach a hybrid course, and we met twice a week. And they have a really large project at the end of the semester, but every week they have discussion group where they have to submit lots of information about the articles that they read. And so after everything went online, I heard from a few of the groups saying, listen, my group members, certain group members aren't participating. They've like fallen off, right? And so that was a clue to me that if it's happening on these weekly discussion groups, then I could only imagine with what the large project paper is going to look like. And so what I did is I had to make a judgment call, and I said, well, let's keep up with the weekly discussion groups, but let's focus our paper rather than a full-fledged, 12+ paper. Let's do a detailed outline instead. So that was my compromise, and that was well received, and they were grateful because of the lack of interaction. It just fell off, after everything went online. So that was the one thing that I think that helped me.
Okay, good. Glad you were able to adjust and it was successful. Cassandre, I'm not sure. I don't think you were teaching in the spring, but you still may have some words of wisdom to share.
Sure. So yes, I did not teach this spring, but I wanted to share some data from the Student Experience in the Research University survey. I'm PI on that survey here and part of a consortium of institutions that deploy this survey. And we had a special COVID edition of this to gather students' impressions of what happened during the spring semester. And a couple of points that I think might be relevant to knowing and understanding sort of what happened in spring and thinking about pivoting for fall is the vast majority of our students rated that they adapted well or very well to online instruction. But there was a substantial difference for students who identified as low income. 40% of those students suggested that they adapted well or very well. And I think that that's an important consideration for us as we're thinking about our course modalities, that low-income students are facing huge barriers to participation that we may not have thought of, especially in the pivot. The number one obstacle that students rated to their online learning, 84.4% cited a lack of motivation for online learning. So remembering that that is the thing that students were struggling with most is just being motivated to do all of this. That's understandable given the large emotional toll that this quick and rapid pivot did on all of us. But the next big obstacle was the lack of interaction and communication with other students. So to the extent that we can build in that communication, not only with you as an instructor, but with each other in the class, that's going to help alleviate some of the concerns that students had in this transition. 62% of our students reported lack of access to an appropriate study space. So again, the options that students had for continued engagement in the spring was not as good as it was for them prior to COVID. But overall, Moody got the highest ratings of satisfaction with support from their instructors. 89.6% of students rated that their Moody instructors, they were satisfied with the support from their Moody instructors. So that there's a balance here, right? And some of the hints and suggestions that we've given as a group here really feed into the importance of making yourself available and letting students know how much you support them. A couple other pieces that I just want to circle back around the financial impacts is that 50% of our students in Moody reported that they worried they would not have enough money to cover the cost of housing during the spring semester because of their COVID-related concerns. And 29.5% worried that their food would run out before they had money to buy more. So our students are facing some unique challenges, or face some unique challenges in the spring that we've been working to try and help mitigate as an institution, but they're not all going to be gone. And I think that's an important consideration as we're making the pivot as well.
Really interesting, Cassandra. Is that published somewhere that you could provide a link? I'm sure many people would like to dig into that a little bit deeper.
I have a sort of highlights of the results that I'd be happy to figure out a way to share with this group and or post online.
Yeah, if you send that to me, when I send out the link for the recording, I can include that.
Great.
Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so moving on, we expect that some students will get sick during the fall, and we will have to deal with their inability to come to class, to attend Zoom sessions. Particularly if you have a face-to-face class, they will not be able to continue coming to the face-to-face class, whether they're disabled by the sickness or just for contagion reasons, that they don't want to spread the virus. So, Cassandra, I know that you have some special guidance. I was on an email recently where you provided guidance. If someone is teaching face-to-face and they have students get sick, can you share with faculty what is required for them to do if suddenly their face-to-face or hybrid student cannot attend class?
So the expectation from the provost's office, and I want to make it clear that these are the expectations from the provost's office, is that we are working to give maximum flexibility to students, and that we know and understand this is going to happen, and that we are as flexible as possible. So a couple of the suggestions and guidelines: to record in some way, shape, or form the lectures and class sessions that are occurring, particularly in face-to-face and hybrid courses. We have outfitted virtually every classroom space that's being used in Moody with the technology to do this. And the other instructional units across campus have been doing the same in most of our other classrooms. Charles Soto will be sending forth information to each of you about what the tools and technologies are in the room that you may be assigned and how to do that. So the number one recommendation is go ahead and record things. It'll just make it easier. The second is to be mindful of the fact that while deadlines and due dates are important, that when we have a student who goes out sick, some of the things that they are able to do is entirely dictated by their impact, their quarantine status, and their access to other materials during that quarantine status, so that as much as we can provide maximum flexibility, the better. We don't want students returning to classes or returning to work unnecessarily early because we have set a deadline that we're not flexible about. I know that this is really challenging, and it can be challenging because it creates work on us, it creates work on the flow of the class, but we've been asked to be really thoughtful about this. The key points to all of this have been in a series of emails sent from the provost's office. I can share some links to those most recent ones here in this session, as well as make sure Mary has copies of all of those. Most importantly, if you run into a situation with a student and you just aren't sure what to do about it, reach out to me and my office. We will do our absolute best to make sure that we connect you and or the student with the resources you need, or to provide guidance on how best to make an accommodation. So that tool is always available, and that's what I expect to spend a lot of my fall semester doing is supporting and consulting with you all when weird situations arise. They will arise, and we'll do our best to work together to support them.
Thank you. I know a lot of people have questions about how they're going to handle these situations as they arise. And so this leads into the next question, which is, we know we're going to have to be flexible, offer extensions, alternatives, but I'd like to discuss how do we maintain academic rigor and high standards? And by that, I mean ensuring that students will achieve at least the minimum learning outcomes for the course, while at the same time showing compassion, extending grace, providing accommodations for these different circumstances, whether it's due to illness, technology limitations, personal space, all those things you mentioned. So let's start with Gary. How do you balance academic rigor with the need to be flexible and accommodating?
I'm just a mean guy. That's all there is to it. And so I'm just kidding. I'm not that mean. At least I don't think I am. Well, I was going to make a point. Somebody made something a little bit earlier somebody said something about enthusiasm. I think Cassandre did it. They're enthusiastic about what they were doing. And, I think we, as leaders, have to go into that with an enthusiastic attitude, like, oh my God, we can't, no, what are we gonna do now? But going, hey, here's a new challenge, this is what we can do about this. And me being an old musician kind of guy, I kind of said, okay, this is kind of like playing live versus recording. And so you play live and you get an instant feedback in the classroom, and we all love that. But then you record, it's a really different experience. And so you kind of set your mind a little bit to that perspective, I think. So I think the idea is just kind of make it fun and say, hey, let's have fun here. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting to shift that attitude and motivation is in the social media class, I right away, you would think these kids in social media would adapt to this thing pretty well, and they did, but they still had that attitude about, oh my God. And so I had a guest speaker who runs the social at Dell come on, and the show, that was the first guest speaker I had. There was a live Zoom in the spring semester. And she told him, she said, hey, this is an advantage for you. We've been meeting like this worldwide for 2 or 3 years. And she said, we had to develop our Zoom skills, I guess you could call it, as part of our business. And so you have an advantage because you're getting to do this now. And so that really kind of changed the attitude of most of the kids in that class. And they all kind of said, hey, yeah, we are learning something new here. And this is a skill we can apply in the future. So kind of those two things I think I wanted to kind of throw in there. And as far as accommodating, if they're sick, you gotta pull off and say, hey, let's see if we can get you better. Maybe giving them an incomplete if they're really sick and can't come back. But certainly recording and making sure everything's available to them is an important part of this thing too. So I don't have any hard and fast solution, but that's kind of my take.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I really appreciate your attitude about making it fun. Learning is hard work, but it can also be a lot of fun. So we need to remember that and inspire students to enjoy it when they can. Okay, turning to Mallary, how do you balance academic rigor with flexibility?
Yeah, so one of the things that I found was helpful was just being super transparent about deadlines and sending many reminders about them. So I had students do the same amount of assignments as I would have them do in person, but I sent them a lot more reminders. So I would send them a reminder each day when we were meeting online with the Zoom link, even though I had sent it previously. Whenever a deadline was coming up, I would say, I just want to remind everybody, you've got this deadline coming up tomorrow. I'm available if you need to talk. And so just sort of reminding them of that, because one of the things I found anecdotally was that a lot of students said that once they shifted online, it was much harder for them to stay organized. And it was easier for them to just sort of lose track of what was due when, even though it was in the calendar and whatnot. So I think that was helpful. And then also staying on top of sort of the posting of the recorded lectures. So for instance, if we had a recorded lecture, I told students this is going to be available by 8 a.m., the day of the recorded lecture. So I would post it. And the way I did it was I created separate pages for each recording of both recorded lectures and live lectures, and also included a link to the transcript as well for students who might find that helpful. And then, you know, if we had a live lecture, then by the end of that day, usually that afternoon, I would post the recording to that. So just trying to stay on top of sort of the frequency of that and making sure that all of those postings are up to date. Another thing I found too that was helpful is having deadlines be at 11:59 p.m. It's interesting because some of my students said, oh, well, a lot of my professors are making things due at 5 p.m. and that's so hard for me because I have classes in the afternoon or I have to go to work after class. And so a lot of the best work that I do is at night. And so I can relate to that as someone who likes to do a lot of my writing work at night. So even that small thing of having the 11:59 p.m. deadline was helpful. The last thing I'll mention too is that, you know, typically in an in-person setting, I place a lot of value on participation, which of course can be a little bit harder in an online setting. And I think it's especially hard for introverts. And I say that as someone who's an introvert myself. But when you're in person interacting with students, you can pick up more on those visual cues where students may kind of raise their hand or they may lean forward or you can see them trying to interject. So one of the things that I did was I, in course, encouraged students to participate during the live sessions, but I also told students, I said, hey, if you've got a question, just, you know, throw it in the chat feature. And then instead of just reading off what they had typed in the chat feature, I would then call on them when it was time to sort of address questions. And I would say, hey, Mary, I saw that you asked this question. Do you want to go ahead and pose it to the group? So that way they were still able to sort of have their voice and say what they wanted to say. And I think the chat feature actually was helpful because it did seem to encourage more participation and was sort of this launching pad for what then became more of sort of a, you know, virtual face-to-face conversation, if you will. And that's, again, where having their videos turned on was also really helpful in terms of fostering that sense of community within the class.
All right, great suggestions. Thank you, Mallory. Let's turn to Dina. How do you balance academic rigor with flexibility and accommodations?
Well, for me, I start from where I begun. Like my hybrid class was a flipped classroom. And so all of my lectures were already pre-recorded. And so for me, because I was in a flipped classroom, we spent time doing participation and activities in class. And so for me, going into this next semester and planning a new prep, I made a decision to make a choice between either they're going to have these really weekly ongoing tasks versus these long-term tasks that could be scaffolded out. Choose one and be very clear and emphasize everything that's done throughout the semester rather than have both and require that they not only stay on task during the week, but they also have to keep their eyes on the greater prize, which is, you know, a larger project or whatever have you. But so for me, it's the flexibility is giving them some space on a week to week basis and have them just focus in on one goal rather than having lots of different goals coming at them. So to put it simply, choose, you know, whether you're going to do more of your weekly task or long-term task for the class.
All right, good advice. And that echoes back to Gary's advice to keep it simple.
Yeah.
Cassandre, how about you? Do you have more to say about academic rigor versus flexibility?
Sure. I think it's not an either or. You can have an extraordinarily flexible course that is very rigorous because the rigor is in the depth, the attention to detail, the thoroughness, and that can be achieved in lots of different ways while being flexible. And so I think we've often mistaken the rigor of a course for whether we're tight with deadlines and whether we allow students to be late or turn things in differently. And I would argue that's not where the rigor lies at all. So we can be as flexible as we want and as flexible as possible, just like everyone has described before, multiple ways of achieving the specified learning outcome. A desire to have those outcomes set by a particular date and time. None of that has anything to do with actual rigor in our courses. The rigor is embedded in how we teach, what we look for, and how we assess. So I think as much flexibility as we can offer our students, the better situation we will have, particularly again this semester where things just aren't aren't the way they have always been.
Great. That reminds me of the old phrase, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And for me, it's all about achieving those learning outcomes. And there are many ways to get there. So I agree 100%. All right, great. Well, we are right on time. It's 11:45, and now it is time to go into the question and answer phase. So, Ivy, can you, have you pulled some questions out of the chat that we should address?
Yeah, so most of them were addressed within the chat. So thank you to everyone who chimed in there. Dr. Riso is wondering more about the GroupMe communication function. So I was just wondering if the panelists could talk a little bit more about the specific communication technologies that you've been using to reach out to students beyond Canvas, I guess.
I will just let you speak up, whoever has something to say about GroupMe or other technologies.
Well, in the social class, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's Mary.
In the social class, we use, oh my God, I just forgot the name of it. I'll come back to Slack. There we go. We use Slack. Okay, there you go. Sorry. Same kind of thing, but you know.
Yeah, I use Slack as well once we transitioned online in the spring. And yeah, I think that what I learned from that experience was that it's really helpful to just sort of realize that not all students necessarily know how that platform works. I'm using Slack on a daily basis to interact with colleagues, but that was a reminder that, okay, you might have to just offer a little tutorial for students so that they understand how this works and operates. And you can also convey that bigger picture of the fact that a lot of, offices and employers use Slack. So this can be a good sort of entry point into that. For the summer session that I taught, people were more inclined to want to use GroupMe. And so I used GroupMe for the first time, and it's essentially a group text, platform. And it was really helpful because some students just had questions, like they would say, oh, well, does anyone know, what we should be doing for this particular assignment? Or, they would have specific questions for each other. They would say, hey, can somebody give me feedback on this sentence I just wrote? And so it's really actually interesting to see some of the interactions among students that were taking place there. And because they were already on their phones, that became a very kind of easy place for them to go to share ideas or to ask questions to each other and to me, because they could, message me individually on the app as well. The other thing I would just mention with regard to having those channels is that I always made it clear to students that I would always communicate information about the course on Canvas. I didn't want them to feel sort of as though they would have to check, 5 different places, GroupMe, Slack, email, all these different places in order to find out information about the course. So I told them, I said, I'll always post information related to assignments and anything else course related on Canvas. And our official mode of communication will be through Canvas Mail. But if you have questions for me, or if you want to chat with your classmates about assignments, feel free to then turn to Slack or GroupMe. And just lastly, I think it's helpful to pick one, whether that be GroupMe or whether that be Slack. If you've got too many of these sort of social platforms, sometimes it can get a little overwhelming, and then it sort of doesn't create as strong of a sense of community. Whereas if you have one and you stick to that one, I think that tends to work most effectively.
Good to know. Good to know. Steve is also asking, if you have a big class, do you break the GroupMe into discussion sections? Does anyone have experience with a big class, and GroupMe? I guess not. Okay.
I'm just going to try to find this is Ivy again. I'm going to try to find the example from the previous panel when Josh Barber was talking about how he uses Slack, because there's a video recording of him he goes through his Slack and just sort of shows how he set that up. So I'll try to find that link and put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Yes, that is on the website. There should be a link to that video now, but I have to say for FERPA concerns, we had to blur out the Slack because we can't show student names and student comments. So you can hear what he says about it, but the video of the Slack has been blurred out for FERPA concerns. So
One thing
Ivy, are there any other questions we should address from the chat?
We do not have any other questions in the chat.
Okay, so I'll just put it out to the world here, or our participants. What other questions do you have? Feel free to turn on your audio and video and ask, or I'm looking at the participant panel. You can use the raise hand feature there. And surely we have some questions out there.
Mary, if I may, I just wanted to mention that if you do have a big class and it's a team taught class, one option is to have sort of each professor set up an individual group me as opposed to having one big one for the class. So that's something that worked well with J317 as opposed to having sort of one, group me for 75 students, which could be a bit overwhelming.
Yes, it could. Good advice. Yeah. Well, I'll just ask, what about efficiency tips? This is going online for a lot of instructors is more work. And so for those of you who are experienced online instructors, what advice do you have for just not for managing it and having the whole workload not be overwhelming?
Mary, I'll chime in. The thing that I do each semester is just make sure that my class is completely prepped before I hit that publish button. The more I spend time before the semester starts, the less time I have to spend. I could really devote it on the students and responding to emails and on time and just being attentive rather than having to prep the class when I should be focused on, the students. So the more you have it prepped, and I know it's not a perfect world, but the more you have it prepped, the less you have to do in terms of maintenance.
That's good to hear. And it is hard to prep the whole thing. Dina, do you release content? Do you set up modules where they have to complete one module before the next module opens up, or is everything open from the beginning?
I used to do that. When I first started teaching online, I used to set that up, but I stopped because I came across so many students who said, listen, I want to get ahead in this class. And, for me to get to that point or start to prep for a paper or something, then they had to wait until they read something, right? So for me, I let the whole class just be open so that those proactive students can move ahead.
Okay, good to know. Other tips for efficiency?
Hey, Mary, I'll chime in. Just having ported one class to online for the second summer session, a couple things. One, tremendous amount of upfront work, as you know, in mastering these classes on the front end. But quite frankly, I have to tell you, on the back end, I found it to be a tremendous time saver. I think a lot of the lessons that you guys pointed out early on around personal connection and setting expectations are super important. And again, I don't have anything to contribute other than just over communicating in both additional details in a syllabus, as well as hosting an initial kickoff class and going very deep into process oriented questions. Because again, if you can set that protocol and address their insecurities on the front end, I've found that on the back end, it's been a huge time saver. So I do think that upfront work on the front end is really appropriate and helpful to making this a much more efficient. And I found the process that kind of like Gary, and I've got similar to Gary. Well, Gary and I are similar. We both have large classes. We're both musicians and we're both mean. But I'm kind of strict on some of my attendance and some of my other policies. But to be very honest with you, I've had very few one-offs where I had to do special circumstances. And as opposed to set up macro rules, it's been better to deal with those as one-offs from an efficiency standpoint, to deal with those occasional call-outs. But otherwise, it's been pretty smooth sailing. And, call out to you and your team for making this all possible, because you guys have been great. But I've gotten a lot of efficiency on the back end.
All right, that sounds encouraging. And also, when you're doing this upfront prep work, think about how to make it longer, having a longer lifespan than just the semester. because that's a lot of investment, and you can refrain from referring to sometimes current events or the test next week or things like that that make it a little bit less reusable. So think about how to make that where you can use it for more than just one semester, so it can have a long shelf life, because it is a lot of effort.
Yeah.
All right, we have a question in the chat about, from Kathleen. What do you think about peer reviewing as engagement? And I am all for peer review. I think it's a great way to engage students and get them to think more critically, but I open it up. Who else has opinions about peer reviewing?
I think it can be really helpful. I used it in the summer, and I just regret not having done it earlier in the summer session. I sort of saved it for the end of the summer course for the last week, in which, you know, in lieu of a class that day, I basically paired up the students and asked them to set aside 20 to 30 minutes just to share their stories with each other and give each other feedback. And the feedback across the board from that was incredibly positive, where students said, oh, like it helped me feel connected to another student. It helped me get great feedback. One pair of students said that they talked for an hour and 15 minutes. And so, you know, it was like really just sort of eye-opening. It made me think, huh, like that type of engagement with the students is both informative, you know, they can learn a lot from it, but it also does create this sense of community that can be really hard to obtain in a virtual setting. So in retrospect, I think I would have done it maybe on a more weekly basis, or at least more frequently than I did.
All right, good to hear. Anyone else have comments on peer engagement, peer reviewing?
Michael here. I'm a huge believer in it. My classes and the reporting is essentially an ongoing news meeting where we are constantly working on the reporting process and getting engagement between the reporters, the students, helping each other out, troubleshooting, coming up with suggestions, sharing their ideas about how to make the story deeper or better, or find different characters. So yeah, for me, that's a big chunk of a class.
All right, good to hear. And in case you're not aware, there is a peer review feature in Canvas. When you create an assignment, there is a checkbox there that you can say peer review. You can say how many peers will review each other's work. When you do that, they then get access to their online submissions and can use the speed grader annotation comment feature, leave comments, and there is even a way, and I can't tell you how to do it right off the top of my head, but a way, if you have a rubric in there, a grading rubric, they can actually score their peers' work, and it will average those scores and enter it as the grade. Of course, you as the instructor have final authority over what the student's grade is, and it's always good to look to see if all of the peer review grades kind of cluster together and look right, versus there's some real strange outliers. That's when you might want to investigate a little bit more. But I think it's a great way to kind of ease your grading burden at times, and then give them the experience of thinking critically about someone else's work and how it can improve. Okay, we are at 11:58. Is there any other pressing questions? Yes, Gary.
I just want to thank you for the wonderful job you've done for the whole college. You know, I've learned more than I can ever imagine from your ability. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. You know, I love my job. And so please don't ever hesitate to call on me. I am very happy in what I do. Thank you. So I think with that, we will go ahead and sign off. I will send the recording along with some other information out to everyone who is on this call and the others who were not able to make it. And I think this is going to be our last panel for the summer, and I consider this very successful. Thank you very much, Cassandra, Gary, Mallory, Dina, and thanks to Christian for taking notes. Thanks to Ivy for monitoring chat. And please don't hesitate to contact me or Moody online at austin.utexas.edu. And Kate Osmond, who is on this, she is new. Kate Osmond, I want to introduce my new instructional designer. And Ivy and I, we monitored this email and we are here to help you. So please reach out if you need us. Thanks very much. Bye.